They're getting lunch, so make this quick, and then if y'all have questions, I'll be happy to visit with you later. I just wanted to cover a bit about toxic plants. I think they're especially important during times of drought because there's less available, and so the livestock might be more likely to eat something that they wouldn't in normal years, provided good range condition. So that's why the focus on toxic plants today. In Texas, we do lose $50 to $100 million due to livestock losses from toxic plants each year. There are about 200 plants in Texas that are toxic to livestock, but really only about 80 of those have caused an economic loss to producers. But what I want to be really careful about pointing out is that we have about 5,000 plants in Texas. And so given that only 200 are actually toxic, less than 4% of plants are toxic. So we don't want people to have the idea that all plants are bad. And later today, during my brush and weeds talk, we'll be talking a bit about why weeds are a good thing in some cases. So keep in mind that the toxic plants are a very limited number, but they are important because they could cause you some economic loss. So sometimes some stages are just more toxic than others. It's not necessarily that the plant in all stages would be toxic or harmful. Sometimes they're quite palatable when they're young, and maybe like the silverleaf nightshade, when they're mature, they're more toxic. Broadleaf milkweed happens to be the opposite, and it's more toxic when it's young. Certain plant parts are also more toxic. For instance, a lot of times seeds or berries are more toxic than in the actual leaf. Although a lot of times the leaves are also poisonous, they would just have to eat more of them to equal what their berry would be. Some conditions create toxicity, which I'm talking about especially because of drought. Sometimes when that plant slows down growth, whether it's because of a cold snap or because of drought, it has the possibility to accumulate more of the toxicity in it, and that therefore it makes it more toxic at that time. So often livestock are just going to avoid these plants altogether because they don't necessarily taste good or they're not all that palatable. But if they're put in a situation like during drought where there's nothing else available, or maybe a trap situation if you're going to work your livestock and you put them in a smaller pen and all they have available are plants that may be toxic to them, it's important to keep that in mind because that's when we typically see a lot of issues and a lot of livestock loss. If you're interested in learning more about toxic plants or having a book on hand, this Toxic Plants of Texas done by Dr. Charlie Hart, who happens to be my department head, is really excellent. I have it here today if you want to check it out before you look. And that's available in the AgriLife bookstore. We're also at the end going to look at a way you can access this completely online for free. So there are other search engines available if you're computer literate. So now I'm just going to go through a few toxic weeds. I've made a few notes about some weeds that I think are important to us in South Texas. I'd like to thank Jason Holt with NRCS for his input on some ones that he thought were important, and also our retired range specialist, Dr. Wayne Penselka. So I decided to cover about 6 groups, 5 specific groups, and then I had a couple other plants I wanted to throw in there just for fun today. And we'll just move through these, and then at the end, if y'all have specific questions, I can attempt to answer those. The first one I wanted to talk about is the nightshades, because last year you'll notice that we had a whole lot of especially silverleaf nightshade in our area. It did really well during the drought. Nightshades are in the Solanum genus. They do cause nitrate poisoning, but it's really the glycoalkaloids and the solanine that I'm talking about right now. These plants are really unpalatable, so it really has to be in a situation where livestock are forced to eat them before they will. Of course, the more mature plants or ripe fruits, like we saw in the example with silverleaf nightshade, are more poisonous. And typically to take care of them, something like Graze on P+D, Weedmaster, Graze on Next, something with a broadleaf label usually does the trick. So today I want to cover especially 3 nightshades. What's really interesting about nightshades is that they're in the potato family. I don't know if y'all knew that or not, but I'd much rather eat a potato than a silverleaf nightshade. But they are in the same family. First of all, silverleaf nightshade, it can poison all livestock, but cattle really are the most susceptible. It can cause problems when only 0.1 to 0.3% of the animal's weight is eaten in this plant. It causes nervous effects and gastrointestinal irritation, which is typical of all the nightshades. Carolina horse nettle is very significant because of that lobed, that sharply lobed shaped leaf. It also causes gastrointestinal irritation and nervous system issues such as trembling and weakness. These distinct large teeth in the 5-petal flower are how I normally identify this plant. Buffalo burr is another one. It's in the nightshade family. It's found all throughout the state. Again, just like the other nightshades, gastrointestinal and nervous system issues, as well as those spines make it quite stand out in your field. I wanted to cover a bit about Sesbanias, particularly one Sesbania that we have here. It's a neat group to look at because the poison livestock don't actually show any noticeable signs. So sometimes the first thing you notice is that you have dead livestock. And with good range management, a lot of times you can eliminate these from your pastures because they're not good competitors. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And also mowing could be an option if you do have it in your place. The main one that I'd like to talk about is cinnamon. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but especially up in the Victoria area, they have a lot of cinnamon. Some people refer to it as Drummond Sesbania as well, or I've also heard it called rattlebox. That's another common name. Its leaves are very characteristic, four-winged structure, and the seeds have the cross partitionings, like with a little wing on each side, and so they're very easy to identify that you have cinnamon in the pasture. They kind of droop from the stems in a way. The next group I want to cover is prussic acid poisoning. We've probably all heard of prussic acid poisoning. Sometimes it's called cyanide poisoning because that's the actual toxic agent, the free cyanide, or it's called HCN poisoning. So basically it's the accumulation of these plant metabolites in the leaves, and what it does is it deprives the cells from carrying the oxygen around for the animals. So again, a lot of times the poisoning takes effect quite quickly, so you may not see any signs because of this oxygen depletion across their body. They could occur from anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes after they ingest these toxic agents. You'll see sometimes salivation, muscle tremors, or convulsions, but again, it's pretty quick. A lot of times we hear about prussic acid poisoning in regards to sorghum because they're quite famous for that. Sorghum's under stress from rapid growth, so maybe if they were just fertilized, or during drought, where again it stunts the growth and that free cyanide is allowed to collect in the leaves. That's when you see the most issues. And also in freshly frosted plants. So I got some calls this year from the valley when they had a nice field of sorghum, and then we had a little bit of cold snap. They were concerned that it would have built up in the leaves. So certain feeds actually will decrease the cyanide release, so that might be an option if you're concerned about that in your pastures. But usually we say if you have these plants, that it'd be best just to, as with all toxic plants, just avoid having your livestock eat them. Maybe put them in a different pasture for a period of time. So I'm going to cover two specific plants that we have in South Texas that are known for cyanide poisoning. The first one is Johnson grass. I get a lot of questions about Johnson grass. It grows throughout the state. It's actually quite a robust grass and can get up to 6 feet tall. When the seeds are mature, they turn that purplish color, so it's easy to identify. This was actually an introduced grass from Turkey in the 1800s, but now it's considered a weed in most cultivated fields. Another plant that will exhibit prussic acid poisoning, although it's not often, looks quite different than the other plants we've covered so far. It has a woody base and a milky sap. It's Queen's Delight. It's actually a really great food for turkey and other grassland birds. It has, there's a few different species, and a number of them have these long linear leaves, and we see these most commonly, and they're not actually poisonous. It's a third species called, let me get this right, Trichostallingia. It has more rounded leaves, and so it's that Queen's Delight that we're more concerned about. The next group I want to cover quickly is nitrate poisoning. Nitrate poisoning, again, is from soil high in nitrogen, either by fertilization or maybe a buildup of manure in the pasture. And also when the plants slow down, same kind of thing as we talked about with prussic acid poisoning. And it too disrupts the cell's ability to carry oxygen, so death is quite quick. Plants with more than 1% nitrate are dangerous, so that's not a whole lot, but there are some weeds that are more toxic. Also, keep livestock off heavily infested pastures during early stages, or again, after these sudden temperature changes, we just want to avoid grazing them. So there's three species I want to talk about today that will exhibit nitrate poisoning. The first one is goathead or puncture vine. This is quite an ugly plant anyways, because you could have guessed by its name, goathead or puncture vine, it has some really stiff thorns. And so in addition to being toxic at times, it can also cause lesions in the mouth, and you could get some infection through that way as well. It actually breaks, that little seed breaks into 5 nutlets, and each have those 2 strong spines coming off of them, probably where you get the name puncture vine. It also has a small yellow flower with 5 petals. It was actually introduced from Europe, unfortunately. It's found all throughout Texas, except not necessarily on the Gulf Coast in Far East Texas. In the next section, we're going to see it categorized for photosensitization as well, but it can cause nitrate poisoning. And again, livestock are going to avoid this plant unless they're more forced to eat it. Most broadleaf herbicides will take care of goathead. Johnson grass is again on the hook here, but this time for nitrate poisoning. In addition to prussic acid poisoning, it can accumulate these high nitrate levels in especially poisoned sheep and cattle. The last one I want to talk about in reference to nitrates is careless weed, or sometimes we call it pigweed, and that's because swine actually do love this plant. Careless weeds are annuals, and Texas has about 23 of these careless weed annuals found throughout it. Most love disturbed sites, so you'll find them a lot of times around barnyards or under shade trees and in croplands. It's found everywhere in Texas except, again, far northeast Texas. More than 1% of the nitrate is dangerous, and again, careless weeds are also put on the spot for causing bloat, so they can cause a number of things depending on their stage and how much is eaten. The nitrate content is higher in the morning than the afternoon, which I thought was interesting, but livestock should really be kept off of these plants in any of their early stages or after, again, drought and temperature changes. So we're kind of seeing a pattern here. We talked about, or maybe we did talk about 2,4-D can actually increase nitrate content. So you want to be careful when you treat any of these species that could accumulate nitrate with 2,4-D. But really, this plant, you should keep off of it for a little while after you use any herbicide and allow it to dry out before you graze it again, just because its ability to pick that up. Okay, the last big group we're going to talk about is photosensitivity. This is basically just a hypersensitivity to light. So a lot of times these animals will be characterized by looking sunburned, especially on their muzzle or tender areas or lighter areas. Although just having sunburn won't necessarily kill the animal, it does cause a lot of issues, especially if they have a calf. They'll be less likely to want to nurse, and so you might have an issue with those calves. But there's actually 2 different forms of this, and the one is the primary, which is the less lethal, and it's caused directly by the plant toxin. But there's a second form called hepatogenous, and it damages the liver. So this is the one we would be more concerned about because you may not see as many outward signs, but it is causing damage to the liver. It may affect cattle less, and in some areas like DeWitt County where they have a large issue with this, with I believe rain lily, they tend to graze more black cattle just to avoid this problem. So. We're going to talk about 3 different plants that show signs of photosensitivity. One, again, is goathead. It's known for causing sensitivity issues. It also accumulates nitrates, like we just talked about. And especially in sheep and possibly cattle, we see this photosensitivity. All parts of this plant are toxic, but the wilted parts of the plant are worse, so you'll want to really watch it during those stages. Again, practice good range management, and you could eliminate a lot of this, but keep in mind when you're managing, if you have this on your pastures, this plant loves disturbed soils. So be careful if you're going to do anything mechanically or disturb the soil. because there's a good chance this is going to encroach in that area. Okay, climb grass, I think we've probably all heard about. It's causing some issues. It's actually a very desirable forage grass. It can get up to 50 inches tall, great to graze. It was brought over from Africa in the 50s, and it was actually bred to be a really good forage grass. So definitely not promoting not using this one, but the saponins that cause liver damage in horses, sheep, and goats can also cause photosensitization in small ruminants. So you want to watch that. If you desire climb grass for cattle grazing, there's good news that it rarely affects cattle, so you don't have to be as worried about that. But the new green growth seems to be a lot worse. It's also generally a good idea not to graze horses on climb grass, just as a general rule. Avoid that if possible. Rain lily is kind of a neat plant. It's found in a lot of parts of the state. It grows from this black underground bulb. It's got these long, thin leaves, and it ends in the desiccated material, which is really important because they don't really know what the toxic agent is, but it seems to be in those dead leaf tips. And also, it only really causes photosensitivity problems in certain counties. So it's weird that it occurs in a lot of the state, but really mainly around DeWitt, Gonzales, and Caldwell counties. They have to be careful with this rain lily plant. Other areas where it occurs, they don't see any photosensitivity. So pretty interesting, but it usually happens in the fall within 10 days of a rain. So that's why they think that there's some microbiological activity maybe on the dead leaf materials on those tips that are responsible for the toxicity, although they haven't really been able to nail down what it is. So another plant that I decided to include in the photosensitivity section is lantana. It's large leaf lantana, and this is a branching shrub. I'm sure you've all seen it throughout South Texas, especially in West South Texas. They have a few small prickles. There's new growth. Their new growth has these kind of square stems. They have oval leaves, and they have those serrated edges around the leaf. It was planted as an ornamental throughout the state when it was first settled. That's how it spread to so many places. But it has trypterpenes, which are responsible for its toxicity. It'll affect livestock, dogs, and even humans. And this causes liver injury. So it's like the secondary photosynthesization, not say that word today, that we talked about, the heptotype. So definitely practice good range management, because when there's other things available, it's unlikely that your cattle or your livestock are going to graze this. And I definitely would not encourage you to graze it as well. Okay, so lobelia is one of the final ones I'd like to talk about. The last two I really don't feel like we're going to have issues with this spring, but I'd like to cover them because we could in the future. This is a cool season annual. It usually doesn't get over 12 inches tall. Its leaves are mostly basal, and they're hairless, and they're oval. So it's hard to see in this picture, but there are some wider leaves down at the very bottom of the base, and that's the leaves I'm referring to. It has this blue-purple flower with a white eye, so that kind of makes it stand out in your pasture. They come with adequate fall and winter rainfall, which is why I say, and I haven't seen any lately, I say it's probably not much of an issue right now, but it does have nicotine alkaloids as its toxic agent, and this plant is very palatable, so that would be of concern. It causes like a nervous system stimulant or depressant, which is interesting. So similar to what you would think of like with nicotine. It causes excitability, or it could cause depression in the cattle where they won't get up and eat or drink. So basically you end up having to kind of cater to them for a couple of weeks even to get them back into good health. You'll have to put them in the shade and provide plenty of food and water. Just don't put cattle in a pasture where you see a lot of lobelia. And that's why it's important to be able to identify your specific range plants you have growing. But 2,4-D or Grazon P plus D in the spring will take care of this plant if you do see any. Another plant I wouldn't expect a lot of issues with right now is Coyotillo. It's a spineless woody vine. We don't have very many woodies that are spineless, and this plant really stands out to me in a field because its leaves are very veined, like the veins are really prominent on it. if you've ever noticed it. You can see in those pictures. And it kind of has an oval shaped fruit that turns like a brownish black when it's ripe. You'll find it a lot on gravelly hills mostly. There's a polyphenolic compound that's thought to be responsible for its toxicity. And Native Americans even knew that these berries would cause paralysis in humans, so it is quite toxic. It's toxic to livestock and also fowl. And we usually have problems with this in the fall or winter, so that would be the time you need to start looking out for it. And you might notice livestock high stepping, jumping backwards, or kind of walking in a dragging motion, and that'll be a good sign that maybe they got a hold of some coyotillo. And as far as I know, there's no treatment for that as of yet, so not a good deal to get into. But basically, don't turn your animals out in a pasture where it has it, especially if they have fruit. And especially unfamiliar animals that are unfamiliar with coyotillo, in particular goats. You could imagine that's because goats are probably more likely to eat this plant, even if there's some good grasses available. And as always, with a lot of these, if you are worried about things, make sure you provide plenty of supplemental feed and minerals, and maintain a good stocking rate. And that's really the key to keeping yourself out of danger with these toxic plants. So if you'd like to look up some more information and again access that toxic plant book, it is right here on the web page. Toxic Plants of Texas. If you go to rangeplants.org, you can access all of this, and I put the website on the bottom of that paper on measuring your forage that we talked about earlier. And then they're in the process of redoing our website, and eventually we'll have even more plants that are in the 4 books that we previously had, and it'll look more similar to this, and you'll be able to search by a number of different features to identify your plants. So we're pretty excited about that capability coming up. And that's it.
All right. Any quick questions for Megan? Okay.
I can have that book if y'all are interested in looking at it on the break.
All right. Well, we're scheduled for lunch. The way we're going to do lunch, we're going